Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Josh, and I took over the narration from Philip. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The security guard noticed it first on a Thursday night in late September. A sound that should not have existed in a building that had been condemned for over 3 decades. It was the unmistakable rumble of wheels on old wooden floorboards, the kind of sound a heavy suitcase makes when dragged across uneven surfaces. He stopped mid-step on his patrol route around the perimeter fence of the Diplomat Hotel ruins in Baguio City and tilted his head toward the skeletal structure looming against the night sky. The sound came again, clearer this time, rolling from somewhere deep within the second floor, a floor he knew for certain had no visitors, no squatters, and no possible source for such a noise. He felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as the rolling continued for another 10 seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind moving through broken windows and the distant hum of traffic from the main road below. The Diplomat Hotel had been a source of unease for decades, long before it became the hollow ruin that now stood behind rusted gates and warning signs. Built in the 1910s as a seminary and later repurposed during World War II, the structure had witnessed atrocities that locals still spoke about in hushed tones. It was said that during the Japanese occupation, executions took place within its walls, that prisoners were held in the basement rooms, and that some never left. After the war, the building briefly served as a vacation house for diplomats before being sold to a private investor who planned to convert it into a hotel. Construction began, but was never completed. Workers reported strange occurrences, tools going missing, shadows moving across walls in rooms where no one stood, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Eventually, the project was abandoned and the building left to decay. By the time the security guard took his position in 2003, the Diplomat Hotel had become a forbidden attraction, a place where curious tourists and thrill seekers would try to sneak in after dark, only to leave shaken and unwilling to speak about what they had seen or heard. The guard himself had been working the perimeter for 2 years and had heard the stories from his predecessor, an older man who quit without explanation after claiming he saw a figure standing in a third-floor window of a room that had been sealed off with concrete blocks. The guard had dismissed it as superstition at the time, but now, standing alone in the dark with that rolling sound still echoing in his mind, he found himself questioning his skepticism. He decided to make a closer inspection of the building's exterior, something he normally avoided after sunset. The path around the hotel was overgrown with weeds and uneven, and the only light came from his flashlight and the dim glow of the city below. As he moved along the western side of the structure, he kept his beam trained on the windows above, searching for any sign of movement. The hotel's facade was a mixture of crumbling plaster and exposed brick, with empty window frames that looked like hollow eyes staring down at him. He reached the rear courtyard, an area that had once been a garden but was now a tangle of dead plants and broken statuary. It was here that he heard it again, not the rolling sound this time, but footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the building, echoing through the empty halls in a rhythm that suggested someone walking with purpose. The guard stopped and aimed his flashlight toward the nearest ground floor window, but the interior was too dark to see anything clearly. The footsteps continued for a moment longer, then stopped. He waited, barely breathing, his hand tightening around the flashlight. Then he heard a voice, faint and distant, speaking in a language he could not understand. It sounded like a man's voice, low and urgent, as if giving orders or instructions. The voice was followed by another, this one higher pitched, almost pleading. The guard felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He knew there was no one inside the building. The entrances were all chained shut, and he had checked them himself at the start of his shift. The voices faded, replaced once again by silence. He backed away from the building, his heart pounding, and returned to the front gate where he spent the rest of his shift sitting in the small guard booth, refusing to look back at the ruins. Word of the guard's experience spread quickly among the local community, and it was not long before a group of photography students from a nearby university decided to visit the site. They had heard the stories before, the tales of restless spirits and unexplained phenomena, but they were skeptical and eager to capture images of the decaying architecture for a project on urban exploration. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all in their early 20s and equipped with digital cameras, tripods, and flashlights. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, believing that daylight would make the experience less intimidating. The gate was locked, but they found a section of the perimeter fence that had been bent back, allowing them to slip through. Once inside the grounds, they were struck by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Even in the bright afternoon sun, the hotel felt wrong, as if the air itself was heavier here, harder to breathe. They began taking photographs, capturing the ornate but crumbling details of the building's exterior, the broken tiles, the empty doorways, the vines that had overtaken much of the structure. One of the students, a young man named Marco, noticed that his camera was behaving strangely. The autofocus kept drifting, refusing to lock onto his subjects, and the screen flickered intermittently. He assumed it was a technical issue and switched to manual focus. As the group moved around the building, they came to a section on the eastern side where a row of windows looked into what had once been guest rooms. Most of the windows were empty frames, but one on the second floor still had glass intact, though it was covered in grime and nearly opaque. Marco raised his camera and took a shot, then checked the screen. What he saw made him freeze. In the window, behind the dirty glass, there was a figure. It was a silhouette, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. The shape was humanoid, but something about it seemed off. Marco zoomed in on the image and felt his stomach drop. The figure had no head. Where the head should have been, there was only empty space, a clean break at the neck. He called the others over and showed them the photograph. They all stared at the screen in silence, then looked up at the window. There was nothing there now, just the grimy glass reflecting the sky. One of the other students suggested it might have been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something inside the room. But Marco insisted the room had been sealed off. They could see the concrete blocks that had been used to close the doorway from the inside. There was no way anyone could be in that room. The group decided to leave shortly after, unsettled by the photograph and the growing sense that they were not alone. As they made their way back toward the gap in the fence, the female student, whose name was Leah, heard something that made her stop. It was the sound of a door creaking open, slow and deliberate, coming from the main entrance of the hotel. She turned to look and saw that the heavy wooden doors, which had been chained shut moments before, were now slightly ajar. The chains hung loose, as if they had been unlocked from the inside. The others noticed it too, and for a moment no one spoke. Then they heard the footsteps, the same slow, deliberate footsteps the security guard had described. They were coming from just inside the entrance, moving closer to the doorway. Marco raised his camera and took a rapid series of shots toward the entrance, the shutter clicking in the silence. Then, without warning, the doors slammed shut with a force that echoed across the entire grounds. The group ran. They did not stop until they were back on the main road, gasping for breath and looking back at the ruins. When Marco later reviewed the photographs he had taken of the entrance, he found something that made him delete the entire set. In the final image, just before the doors slammed, there was a face. It was pale, almost luminous, with hollow eyes and a mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. It was pressed against the gap between the doors, staring directly at the camera. He never showed the photograph to anyone, and he never returned to the Diplomat Hotel. Over the following months, more reports began to surface from security personnel and locals who lived near the ruins. Guards working the night shift described hearing not just footsteps and rolling suitcases, but voices that seemed to come from the upper floors, the areas that had been deemed too dangerous to enter and had been sealed off years ago. The voices were always in languages that sounded foreign, some resembling Japanese, others sounding like Tagalog or Spanish, and they carried an urgency that suggested distress or panic. One guard reported hearing what sounded like a group of people running down a hallway, their footsteps pounding against the floor, followed by a loud crash and then silence. When he radioed for backup and conducted a search of the perimeter the next morning, there was no sign of disturbance, no broken windows or forced entry. Another guard claimed he saw lights moving inside the building late at night, not the beams of flashlights but a softer, flickering glow, like candlelight or lanterns. The lights moved from room to room on the second floor, pausing in each window before moving on. He watched them for nearly an hour before they suddenly extinguished, leaving the building in total darkness. The most disturbing report came from a young woman who had been hired as part of a cleaning crew, tasked with clearing debris from the exterior grounds. She was working alone near the rear courtyard when she heard a woman's voice singing. The song was in a language she did not recognize, but the melody was slow and mournful, almost like a lullaby. She followed the sound to a broken window on the ground floor and peered inside. The interior room was empty except for rubble and old furniture, but the singing continued, growing louder and more distinct. Then as she watched, she saw a shadow move across the far wall, the silhouette of a woman in a long dress, swaying gently as if dancing. The shadow had no visible source. There was no one in the room. The cleaning woman backed away and refused to return to the site. The stories reached a tipping point when a local paranormal investigation team decided to conduct an overnight stay inside the Diplomat Hotel. They had secured permission from the city authorities, who were skeptical but allowed the investigation under the condition that the team signed liability waivers and stayed only in the ground floor areas. The team arrived at dusk, equipped with audio recorders, infrared cameras, and electromagnetic field detectors. They set up their equipment in what had once been the main lobby, a large room with a collapsed ceiling and graffiti-covered walls. The lead investigator, a man in his 40s named Rodrigo, had been researching the hotel's history for years and was convinced that the phenomena were genuine manifestations of traumatic residual energy. As night fell, the team began their investigation, moving through the ground floor and documenting temperature fluctuations, unusual electromagnetic readings, and strange audio anomalies. Around midnight, they heard it, the sound of rolling wheels on the floor above them. It was unmistakable, moving from one end of the second floor hallway to the other. Rodrigo immediately sent 2 team members upstairs to investigate, despite the initial agreement to stay on the ground floor. The 2 investigators climbed the crumbling staircase, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The second floor hallway was long and narrow, lined with doorways that opened into empty rooms. As they walked, they heard the footsteps, slow and measured, coming from somewhere ahead of them. They called out, identifying themselves and asking if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped. Then from the far end of the hallway, they heard a voice. It was a man's voice, speaking in Japanese, the words clipped and authoritative. The investigators did not speak Japanese, but they recorded the audio. When they later had it translated, the words were chilling. The voice was giving orders, telling someone to line up against the wall, to be quiet, to wait for instructions. It was followed by the sound of crying, a woman's voice, and then a loud, sharp crack, like a gunshot. The investigators ran back downstairs, shaken and pale. The team packed up their equipment and left the hotel within the hour. When they reviewed the audio recordings later, they found that the sounds they had heard were captured clearly, but there was something else on the tape. In the background, beneath the Japanese voice and the crying, there was another sound, a low, rhythmic chanting, as if a group of people were praying or reciting something in unison. It went on for several minutes, overlapping with the other voices, creating a cacophony that was almost unbearable to listen to. The investigation team released their findings online, and the story of the Diplomat Hotel spread beyond the local community, attracting attention from paranormal enthusiasts and media outlets across the Philippines and even internationally. The city of Baguio attempted to downplay the reports, citing the need to preserve the site for historical reasons and discouraging trespassers. But the damage was done. The Diplomat Hotel had become infamous, a place where the past refused to remain buried. Locals who had grown up near the ruins shared their own stories, tales passed down from parents and grandparents about the horrors that had occurred during the war, about prisoners who were tortured and executed in the basement, about mass graves that were never properly excavated, about souls that were left to wander the halls because no one had given them a proper burial or acknowledgement. The hotel, they said, was not just haunted. It was a prison for the dead, a place where the final moments of dozens, perhaps hundreds of people were replayed endlessly, a loop of suffering and terror that could not be broken. Some believed that the spirits were trying to communicate, to tell their stories and seek justice or peace. Others believed they were simply trapped, doomed to relive their deaths for eternity, unaware that the war had ended and that the world had moved on without them. The debate raged among believers and skeptics alike, but one thing was certain. Those who visited the Diplomat Hotel and experienced the phenomena firsthand were never quite the same afterward. They spoke of a weight that settled over them while they were inside the grounds, a pressure that made it hard to think clearly, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Some reported nightmares that lasted for weeks after their visit, dreams of running through dark hallways, of hearing voices calling their names, of seeing faces pressed against windows, faces that were pale and expressionless and filled with an ancient sadness. The final incident that cemented the Diplomat Hotel's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the Philippines occurred in early 2005. A documentary crew from a Manila-based production company arrived in Baguio to film a segment on the ruins. They had interviewed several witnesses, including the security guards and members of the paranormal investigation team, and had obtained rare footage of the interior. On the last day of filming, they decided to capture some final shots of the building at sunset, when the light would create a dramatic effect. As the cameraman framed a shot of the second-floor windows, he noticed something strange. In one of the windows, the same one where Marco had photographed the headless silhouette, there was movement. The cameraman zoomed in and saw a figure standing behind the glass. It was a man, dressed in what appeared to be old military clothing, and he was staring directly at the camera. The cameraman called the director over, and they both watched as the figure raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. The hand was pale, almost translucent, and it left no mark on the grimy surface. Then slowly the figure turned and walked away from the window, disappearing into the darkness of the room. The crew reviewed the footage immediately and confirmed that they had captured the figure on film. They packed up and left Baguio that same evening, the footage locked away in their archives. The documentary aired several months later, and the segment on the Diplomat Hotel became one of the most talked about pieces of paranormal evidence in Philippine television history. But the crew never returned to the site, and the cameraman later admitted in an interview that he had been plagued by nightmares ever since the filming. Nightmares in which he was walking through the halls of the hotel, searching for something he could not name, hearing voices that called to him in languages he did not understand, and always, there was the sound of rolling suitcases moving through the darkness, never stopping, never resting. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. Just a few hours south of Baguio, in the heart of Quezon City, another location has earned a reputation that sends shivers down the spines of even the most skeptical. Ballet Drive is a tree-lined road that transforms after midnight, a place where taxi drivers refuse to pick up passengers and where the locals warn visitors to avoid at all costs. The story that follows is perhaps the most well-documented encounter with the supernatural on this infamous stretch of road, an incident that occurred in 1990 and left behind evidence that has never been fully explained. It involves a taxi driver, a woman in white, and a piece of footage that was supposedly confiscated by authorities and never seen again. This is the story of the White Lady of Balit Drive. It was a little past 2 in the morning when Raphael pulled his taxi onto Balit Drive, heading south toward the residential areas beyond. He had been driving for nearly 12 hours and was exhausted, the kind of tired that made his eyes burn and his thoughts sluggish. The road was empty, as it usually was at this hour, and the old balet trees that lined both sides created a canopy so dense that even the streetlights struggled to penetrate the shadows. Raphael had driven this route hundreds of times over the years, and while he had heard the stories about the White Lady, he had never seen anything unusual. He considered the tales to be nothing more than urban legends, ghost stories told to scare children and gullible tourists. But on this particular night, as he rounded a gentle curve near the midpoint of the drive, he saw her standing on the side of the road. She was a woman, dressed in a long white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her hair was long and black, hanging loose around her shoulders, and she stood perfectly still, facing the road. Raphael slowed the taxi, unsure if she was in distress or simply waiting for a ride. As he approached, the woman raised one hand, a gesture that seemed to indicate she wanted him to stop. Against his better judgment, he pulled over and rolled down the passenger side window. The woman walked toward the taxi with slow, measured steps, her dress dragging slightly on the ground. Raphael could not see her face clearly. It was obscured by the shadows and the way her hair fell forward, but something about her presence made him uneasy. She reached the taxi and opened the rear door without saying a word, sliding into the back seat with a movement that seemed almost weightless. Raphael glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look, but she had positioned herself in the corner of the seat, her face turned away from him, staring out the window. He asked her where she was going, but she did not respond. He asked again, louder this time, thinking perhaps she had not heard him. Still there was no reply. Raphael felt a prickle of unease run down his spine, but he told himself that perhaps the woman was deaf or simply exhausted. He put the taxi in gear and continued down Balit Drive, glancing occasionally at the rear-view mirror. The woman remained motionless, her face still turned away, her hands folded in her lap. The interior of the taxi was cold, much colder than it should have been, and Raphael noticed that his breath was beginning to fog in the air. He turned up the heater, but it made no difference. The cold seemed to be coming from the back seat, radiating outward like an invisible wave. Raphael's unease grew into something closer to fear. He tried to focus on the road, but his eyes kept drifting back to the mirror, searching for any sign of movement from the woman. It was then that he noticed something strange. The seat where she was sitting appeared wet. There were dark streaks on the fabric, as if water was dripping from her clothes. Raphael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought about pulling over and asking the woman to leave, but something stopped him. It was a feeling, an instinctive sense that stopping the taxi now would be a mistake. He kept driving, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, Raphael reached the end of Balit Drive and turned onto a larger road with more light and traffic. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, intending to ask the woman one more time where she wanted to go. But the back seat was empty. Raphael slammed on the brakes, causing the taxi to skid slightly before coming to a stop. He twisted around in his seat, staring at the empty space where the woman had been sitting. The seat was soaking wet, the fabric drenched as if someone had poured a bucket of water over it. There was no sign of the woman, no open door, no indication that she had left the vehicle. Raphael's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he tried to process what had just happened. He reached out and touched the wet seat, and his fingers came away cold and damp. The smell in the taxi had changed too. There was a faint, unpleasant odor, like stagnant water and decay. Raphael threw the taxi into park and got out, walking around the vehicle and checking the doors and windows. Everything was closed and locked from the inside. The woman had vanished. Raphael stood on the side of the road, his mind reeling, trying to convince himself that there had to be a rational explanation. But deep down, he knew what he had experienced. He had picked up the white lady of Ballet Drive, and she had disappeared from his taxi without a trace. Raphael did not drive for the rest of that night. He returned to the taxi depot and parked the vehicle, still shaken and barely able to speak. It was only when he was sitting in the break room, drinking coffee, and trying to calm his nerves, that he remembered the dash cam. His taxi was equipped with an old tape-style camera, a relic from the late 80s that recorded onto VHS cassettes. The camera was mounted on the dashboard and had a view of both the front windshield and the rearview mirror. If the woman had been real, if she had truly been in the back seat, the camera would have recorded her. Raphael retrieved the tape from the taxi and took it home, where he had a VCR player. He sat alone in his small apartment, the lights off, and inserted the tape. The footage was grainy and low quality, the kind of image that was standard for the time. He fast-forwarded to the moment when he had picked up the woman on Ballet Drive. The screen showed the road ahead, the dark canopy of trees, and then the figure standing on the side of the road. Raphael paused the tape and leaned closer to the television. The figure was visible, a white shape against the shadows, but the quality of the image made it difficult to make out any details. He resumed the tape and watched as the figure approached the taxi and the rear door opened. The camera angle did not show the back seat directly, but the rearview mirror was visible in the frame. Raphael watched the mirror, his heart pounding. At first, there was nothing, just the empty back seat reflected in the glass. But then, as the taxi began to move, something appeared. It was a face, pale and blurred, staring back at the camera from the rearview mirror. The features were indistinct, as if obscured by fog or water, but the eyes were visible, dark and hollow, and they were fixed directly on the lens of the camera. Raphael felt his blood turn to ice. The face remained in the mirror for the duration of the drive, unmoving, staring. When the taxi reached the end of Ballet Drive and Raphael glanced back at the empty seat, the face vanished from the mirror in the same instant. The tape continued for a few more seconds, showing Raphael pulling over and getting out of the vehicle, and then it cut to black. Raphael ejected the tape and held it in his hands, unsure of what to do. He knew that if he showed this to anyone, they would either think he was lying or accuse him of fabricating the footage. But he also knew that what he had experienced was real, and the tape was proof. The following day, Raphael made the decision to take the tape to the police. He went to the nearest precinct and spoke with an officer on duty, explaining what had happened and showing him the tape. The officer listened patiently, his expression neutral, and then asked Raphael to wait while he consulted with his superiors. Raphael sat in the station for over an hour before a senior officer emerged and asked him to hand over the tape. The officer assured Raphael that they would review the footage and investigate the incident. Raphael gave them the tape, relieved to have someone in authority take his story seriously. But days passed, and he heard nothing. He returned to the station to follow up, but the officer he had spoken with was no longer available, and the staff claimed to have no record of the tape being submitted. Raphael pressed the issue, demanding to know what had happened, but he was met with vague responses and dismissals. Eventually, he gave up. The tape was gone, and with it, the only evidence of what he had experienced. Raphael never spoke publicly about the incident again, but he stopped driving at night, and he avoided Ballet Drive entirely. Other drivers who knew him said that he was never the same afterward, that he had become withdrawn and nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting something to appear behind him. The story of Raphael's encounter spread quickly through the taxi driver community in Quezon City, and it added to the already extensive lore surrounding Ballet Drive. Drivers began to share their own experiences, encounters with passengers who vanished mid-ride, sightings of a woman in white standing by the side of the road, and strange occurrences that defied explanation. One driver claimed that he had picked up a woman on Belit Drive who asked to be taken to a specific address. When he arrived at the location, it was an old abandoned house with broken windows and overgrown weeds. The woman thanked him, paid the fare with wet, crumpled bills, and walked toward the house. The driver watched as she reached the front door and simply passed through it, as if the solid wood was nothing more than a curtain. He drove away without looking back. Another driver reported that his taxi had stalled in the middle of Belit Drive late one night, the engine cutting out without warning. As he tried to restart the vehicle, he saw a figure in the rearview mirror, a woman sitting in the back seat, even though he had not picked up any passengers. She was staring at him, her face pale and expressionless, her hair dripping wet. The driver panicked and fled the taxi on foot, running down the road until he reached a lit intersection. When he returned with a mechanic hours later, the taxi was empty, but the back seat was soaking wet. The incidents became so frequent that many drivers refused to accept fares that involved Belit Drive after midnight. Those who did often drove with their doors locked and their windows rolled up, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look at the rearview mirror. The White Lady of Belit Drive had become more than a legend. She was a presence, an entity that made herself known to those who traveled her road, and the fear she inspired was very real. In the years following Raphael's incident, several paranormal investigators and journalists attempted to document the phenomenon on Belit Drive. Some set up cameras along the road, hoping to capture footage of the White Lady or other supernatural activity. Others conducted interviews with witnesses, compiling accounts of encounters that spanned decades. The most common description of the White Lady was consistent across nearly all reports. She was always seen wearing a long white dress, her hair long and dark, her face obscured or pale beyond recognition. She appeared most often in the early hours of the morning, between 2 and 4, and she was always alone. Those who saw her reported feeling an intense cold, a drop in temperature that was sudden and unnatural. Some also described a feeling of sadness or despair, an emotional weight that seemed to emanate from the figure, as if her presence carried with it the burden of unresolved grief. Theories about the identity of the White Lady varied. Some believed she was the spirit of a young woman who had been killed in a car accident on Belit Drive, her soul unable to move on because of the traumatic nature of her death. Others claimed she was a victim of violence, murdered and left on the side of the road, her spirit seeking justice or vengeance. Still others suggested that she was not a single entity at all, but rather a manifestation of collective trauma, a psychic imprint left by the countless tragedies that had occurred on that stretch of road over the years. Whatever the truth, one thing remained certain. Belit Drive, after midnight, was a place where the line between the living and the dead seemed to blur, where the past refused to stay buried, and where those who dared to travel risked encountering something that could not be explained by logic or reason. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying. The following accounts will take us deeper into the shadows, where rational explanations fail and the truth becomes something much more unsettling. These are stories that have left witnesses questioning their own sanity, stories where the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond is not just thin, but shattered. If you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. Only if you want to, of course. I already appreciate you listening to my videos. The night guard's shift began at 10 in the evening, the same as it always did, and his routine had not changed in the 3 years he had been working at Fort Santiago. His name was Ernesto, and he was a quiet man in his late 50s who preferred the solitude of night work to the crowds and noise that filled the historic site during the day. Fort Santiago, located in the heart of Intramuros in Manila, was a Spanish-era fortress that had served many purposes over the centuries, from military stronghold to prison to tourist attraction. But its history was dark, particularly during World War II, when the Japanese military used its dungeons to hold and torture prisoners. Thousands had died within its walls, and the stories of their suffering had become part of the fort's legacy. Ernesto had heard the tales from other guards and tour guides, stories of shadows that moved without source, of voices that echoed through empty courtyards, and of cold spots that appeared in the dungeons even on the hottest nights. He had never experienced anything unusual himself, and had come to believe that the stories were exaggerated, products of overactive imaginations in the eerie atmosphere of the old stone structure. But on this particular night in late October, something happened that would shatter his skepticism and leave him unable to return to his post. It was just after midnight when Ernesto heard the sound. He was making his rounds through the outer courtyard, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he checked the gates and pathways. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the distant hum of traffic from the streets beyond the fort's walls. It was the sound of crying, soft and mournful, like a child in distress. Ernesto stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint the source. The crying seemed to be coming from the direction of the dungeons, the underground cells that had once held prisoners during the Japanese occupation. The dungeons were located beneath the main barracks, and were accessible through a narrow stone staircase that descended into darkness. Ernesto had been down there many times during his shifts, but always with a sense of unease. The air in the dungeons was thick and oppressive, and the walls seemed to close in around you the deeper you went. The crying continued, growing slightly louder, and Ernesto felt a chill run down his spine. He told himself it was probably an animal, perhaps a cat or a stray dog that had found its way into the dungeons, but something about the sound felt wrong. It was too human, too deliberate. He approached the entrance to the dungeons and shone his flashlight down the staircase. The beam illuminated the first few steps, but beyond that was only darkness. The crying was clearer now, echoing up from below, and Ernesto realized it was definitely the sound of a child. He hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn around and call for backup, but his sense of duty won out. If there was a child down there, lost or injured, he had to help. He began to descend the staircase, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The temperature dropped as he went deeper, the air becoming damp and cold, smelling of mold and earth. The staircase opened into a narrow corridor lined with cells, each one sealed with rusted iron bars. The crying was coming from one of the cells at the far end of the corridor, and Ernesto moved toward it, his flashlight beam sweeping across the floor and walls. The cells were empty, as they always were, filled with nothing but shadows and the remnants of old debris. But the crying persisted, and as Ernesto reached the last cell, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, crouched in the corner of the cell, was a small figure. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, wearing tattered clothing that hung loose on his thin frame. His face was buried in his hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs. Ernesto called out to him, asking if he was all right, but the boy did not respond. Ernesto moved closer to the bars, shining his flashlight directly into the cell. The light illuminated the boy's figure, and Ernesto could see that his clothes were soaked, as if he had been submerged in water. Puddles had formed around him on the stone floor, and his hair was matted and dripping. Ernesto's mind raced. How had the boy gotten down here? How had he gotten wet? There was no water source in the dungeons, no pipes or leaks that could explain the soaked clothing. He reached for the keys on his belt, intending to unlock the cell and bring the boy out. But as his hand closed around the keys, his flashlight flickered and died. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything in an instant. Ernesto cursed and shook the flashlight, tapping it against his palm. The crying stopped. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the sound had been, and Ernesto felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He called out to the boy again, his voice echoing in the darkness, but there was no reply. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was likely only a few seconds, The flashlight flickered back to life. Ernesto aimed it at the cell, his hands trembling. The boy was gone. Ernesto stood frozen, staring at the empty cell. The corner where the boy had been crouching was dry, no puddles, no wet marks on the stone. It was as if the boy had never been there at all. But Ernesto knew what he had seen. The image of the small figure, soaked and sobbing, was burned into his mind. He stepped back from the cell, his heart pounding, and swept the flashlight beam across the corridor. That was when he saw them. Footprints. Small, wet footprints leading out of the cell, through the bars as if the iron had not been there at all. The footprints continued down the corridor, back toward the staircase, and Ernesto followed them with his light. They were clear and distinct, the prints of a child's bare feet, and they glistened in the beam of the flashlight as if they had just been made. Ernesto felt his legs moving before his mind could process what he was doing. He followed the footprints, his breathing shallow and rapid. The prints led up the staircase, out into the courtyard, and across the stone path that ran along the eastern wall of the fort. Ernesto followed them, his flashlight trained on the ground, watching as the prints continued step by step. And then, halfway across the courtyard, they stopped. The footprints simply ended, as if the child had vanished mid-stride. Ernesto stood in the middle of the courtyard, alone in the darkness, the beam of his flashlight illuminating nothing but empty stone. He did not sleep that night, and when his shift ended at dawn, he submitted his resignation. He never returned to Fort Santiago. The story of Ernesto's encounter spread quickly among the staff and guards who worked at Fort Santiago. Some dismissed it as a hallucination, the result of exhaustion or stress, but others believed him. There were too many similar reports, too many accounts of strange occurrences in the dungeons, for it to be coincidence. One of the tour guides, a woman named Isabella, had her own story. She had been leading a late afternoon group through the dungeons several months before Ernesto's incident and had heard the sound of splashing water coming from one of the cells. When she investigated, she found nothing, but the floor of the cell was wet, as if someone had recently been there. Another guard claimed he had seen a small figure dart across the courtyard late one night, moving impossibly fast and disappearing into the shadows near the dungeons. The figure had been too small to be an adult, and the guard had assumed it was a child who had somehow gotten past security. But when he searched the area, he found no one. The most disturbing account came from a maintenance worker who had been tasked with repairing a section of the dungeon's ceiling that had started to crumble. He was working alone, using a portable generator to power his tools, when he felt something tug on the leg of his pants. He looked down and saw a small hand, pale and wet, gripping the fabric. The hand belonged to a child who was staring up at him with hollow, dark eyes. The worker screamed and stumbled backward, and the hand released its grip. When he looked again, the child was gone, but his pants were soaked where the hand had touched them. He refused to return to the dungeons and quit his job the following week. The consensus among those who believed the stories was that the spirit in the dungeons was the ghost of a child who had died during the Japanese occupation. Historical records indicated that families had been held in Fort Santiago during the war, and many prisoners, including children, had perished in the dungeons due to the brutal conditions. Some had drowned when the dungeons flooded during heavy rains, the water rising faster than the guards could evacuate the prisoners. The image of a soaked, crying child fit the description of these victims, and it was believed that the spirit was trapped, reliving the trauma of its death and unable to find peace. There were attempts to investigate the phenomena more formally. A local paranormal research group requested permission to conduct an overnight investigation in the dungeons, but their request was denied by the authorities who managed the site. The official reason given was safety concerns, but those familiar with the fort's reputation suspected the real reason was a desire to avoid drawing attention to the hauntings. Fort Santiago was a major tourist attraction, and stories of ghosts, while intriguing to some, could be damaging to the site's reputation if they became too widely publicized. Despite the lack of official investigation, the stories persisted, passed from guard to guard, from guide to guide, and eventually to visitors who were brave enough to ask. The dungeons of Fort Santiago remained one of the most avoided areas of the fort after dark, a place where even the most skeptical felt an inexplicable urge to leave as quickly as possible. Years later, a journalist researching the history of Fort Santiago uncovered documents that added a chilling detail to the story. Among the records of prisoners held during the Japanese occupation was a list of names, and one entry stood out. It was a boy, age 8, whose name had been recorded along with a note that he had drowned in the dungeons during a flood in 1944. The boy's family had also been imprisoned in the fort, but there was no record of what happened to them after the boy's death. The journalist attempted to track down descendants or any living relatives, but found none. The boy's story, like so many others from that dark period, had been lost to time, but his spirit, it seemed, had not moved on. The journalist included the account in an article about the fort's wartime history, and the story of the crying ghost of Fort Santiago became part of the public record. Visitors to the fort began to ask about the boy, and some even claimed to have heard the crying themselves while touring the dungeons during the day. The staff, bound by their responsibilities to maintain the site's image, offered polite but vague responses, neither confirming nor denying the claims. But among themselves, they spoke in hushed tones about the small, wet footprints that appeared in the courtyard after heavy rains, footprints that led from the dungeons and stopped abruptly as if the child had simply vanished into the air. And on quiet nights, when the fort was closed to the public and only the guards remained, the sound of crying could still be heard, echoing up from the depths of the dungeons, a mournful reminder of a life cut short and a soul that could not rest. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best, but the horrors of wartime Manila do not end with Fort Santiago. Just a short distance away, across Manila Bay, lies Corregidor Island, a place that saw some of the fiercest fighting in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The island is home to numerous ruins, remnants of barracks, bunkers, and hospitals that once served the soldiers defending the Philippines. Among these ruins, one location stands out as particularly unsettling, a place where visitors report encounters that defy explanation and leave them questioning what they have seen. This is the story of the abandoned Corregidor Hospital and the nurse who still walks its halls, a figure in white who appears harmless at first, but reveals herself to be something far more disturbing. The hiker's name was Michael, and he was part of a small group of tourists who had traveled to Corregidor Island for a day of exploration and photography. The island was a popular destination for history enthusiasts and adventure seekers, and Michael had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. He was an experienced photographer with a keen interest in abandoned places, and the ruins of Corregidor offered endless opportunities for striking images. The group had spent the morning touring the main sites, the barracks, the gun emplacements, and the Malinta Tunnel, a massive network of underground passages that had served as a hospital and command center during the war. In the afternoon, they were given some free time to explore on their own, and Michael decided to visit the old hospital ruins, a structure that had been recommended to him by a fellow photographer as one of the most photogenic locations on the island. The hospital was located on a hill overlooking the bay, and the walk up was steep and overgrown, the path barely visible through the thick vegetation. When Michael reached the top, he was struck by the sight of the building. It was a large, 2-story structure, its walls crumbling and covered in vines, its windows empty and dark. The roof had collapsed in several places, and the interior was open to the elements. It looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic film, both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Michael entered the hospital through what had once been the main entrance, stepping carefully over debris and broken glass. The interior was a maze of hallways and rooms, most of them filled with rubble and overgrown with weeds. Sunlight streamed through the broken roof, casting dramatic shadows across the walls. Michael raised his camera and began taking photographs, capturing the interplay of light and decay, the way nature had reclaimed the building. He moved deeper into the structure, exploring the various rooms and corridors, each one revealing a new perspective on the ruin. It was in one of the larger rooms, what might have been a ward or operating theater, that he saw her. She was standing near the far wall, partially obscured by a column. She was dressed in a white nurse's uniform, the kind that would have been worn during the 1940s, with a cap perched neatly on her head. In her hands, she held a clipboard, and she appeared to be reading from it, her head tilted slightly downward. Michael froze, surprised to see another person in the building. He had not heard anyone enter, and the guide had mentioned that the hospital was rarely visited due to its unstable condition. He called out a greeting, but the woman did not respond. She continued to stand there, reading her clipboard, as if completely unaware of his presence. Michael assumed she was perhaps a reenactor, or part of some historical tour group, though it seemed odd that she would be here alone. He decided to take a photograph, both as a souvenir and because the image of the nurse in the ruined hospital would be striking. He raised his camera and framed the shot, zooming in slightly to capture her in detail. But as he looked through the viewfinder, something felt wrong. The woman was too still, her posture too rigid, and her uniform was spotless, without a single smudge or tear, despite the dusty, debris-filled environment. Michael hesitated, then pressed the shutter. The camera's flash went off, illuminating the room for a brief instant. When he lowered the camera and looked back at the woman, she was closer. She had moved several feet toward him, though he had not seen her take a single step. She was still holding the clipboard, still reading, her face obscured by the shadow of her cap. Michael felt a sudden, inexplicable fear. He raised the camera again, intending to take another shot, but as he did, the woman moved again. This time she was even closer, standing in the middle of the room, only a few yards away from him. Her movement had been instantaneous, as if she had teleported rather than walked. Michael's hands began to tremble. He lowered the camera and took a step back, his eyes fixed on the woman. She finally looked up, and Michael saw her face for the first time. It was pale, almost translucent, with features that seemed blurred, as if he were looking at her through frosted glass. Her eyes were dark, empty, and they were staring directly at him. Michael felt his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead. He raised the camera one more time, a desperate, irrational act, and took a final photograph. The flash went off, and in that instant of illumination, he saw that the woman was now standing directly behind him, her face inches from his shoulder, staring into the camera lens. Michael screamed and dropped the camera, turning and running from the room. He did not stop running until he was outside the hospital, stumbling down the overgrown path and back toward the main road where his tour group was waiting. His face was pale, and he was gasping for breath, barely able to speak. The guide asked him what had happened, and Michael tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He spoke of the woman in the nurse's uniform, of how she had moved without walking, of the way she had appeared behind him in the final photograph. The guide's expression shifted from concern to something else, something that looked like resignation. He asked Michael to describe the woman, and when Michael did, the guide nodded slowly. He explained that Michael was not the first person to report seeing the nurse in the hospital. Over the years, numerous visitors had described encountering a woman in a white uniform, always holding a clipboard, always silent. Those who tried to photograph her often reported the same phenomenon, that she would appear closer in each successive photo, moving without any visible motion, as if she were gliding through space. The guide said that the prevailing belief was that the nurse was a remnant spirit from the hospital's wartime days, a member of the medical staff who had died during the Japanese bombing of the island. Her spirit, they believed, was still performing her duties, still tending to patients who no longer existed, trapped in a loop that she could not escape. The guide warned Michael not to go back to retrieve his camera, which he had left in the hospital. Michael had no intention of returning. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to shake the image of the nurse's face, so close to his own, her empty eyes staring into the camera. When the tour group returned to Manila that evening, Michael went straight to his hotel room and did not leave for 2 days. When he finally worked up the courage to look at the photographs he had taken before dropping the camera, he found that the memory card was still intact. The first few images showed the hospital's interior, the crumbling walls and overgrown rooms, exactly as he remembered. Then came the photograph of the nurse standing by the far wall. In the image, she was visible but indistinct, her figure slightly blurred, as if she were moving or out of focus. The second photograph, the one where she had moved closer, showed her standing in the middle of the room, her face still obscured by shadow, but her body more defined. The third and final photograph was the one that made Michael's blood run cold. It showed the nurse standing directly behind him, so close that her face was almost touching his shoulder. But what made the image truly horrifying was that in the photograph, Michael could see himself in the foreground, his own face visible in the reflection of a broken window, and behind him, the nurse's face was clear and distinct. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were not just dark, but hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare through the camera and into the viewer. Her mouth was open slightly as if she were about to speak, and her expression was one of sadness and longing, as if she were reaching out for something she could never have. Michael deleted the photographs immediately, unable to bear looking at them any longer. But the image stayed with him, haunting his thoughts and invading his dreams. He told a few close friends about the experience, but most dismissed it as a trick of the light or a case of overactive imagination. Only one friend, who had also visited Corregidor and heard similar stories, believed him. That friend advised Michael to never return to the island and to consider himself lucky that he had escaped when he did, because, the friend said, there were stories of people who had not been so fortunate, people who had encountered the nurse and had not left the hospital when they should have. These people, the stories claimed, had become disoriented, lost in the maze of corridors and rooms, and some had not been found until hours later, wandering the grounds in a daze, unable to remember what had happened to them. One man had reportedly been found unconscious in one of the hospital's underground rooms, with no memory of how he had gotten there. When he woke, he claimed that the nurse had led him there, holding his hand and guiding him through the darkness, whispering to him in a language he could not understand. He left the island the same day and refused to speak about the incident again. The story of the enchanted nurse of Corregidor Hospital became one of the most well-known ghost stories associated with the island. Tour guides would mention it in passing, usually as a cautionary tale to discourage tourists from wandering into unsafe areas. But for those who had experienced an encounter firsthand, it was more than just a story. It was a vivid, terrifying reality that challenged their understanding of the world. Paranormal researchers who studied the phenomenon offered various theories. Some believed the nurse was a residual haunting, a psychic imprint left by the trauma and suffering that had occurred in the hospital during the war. Others suggested she was an intelligent spirit, aware of the living and actively seeking interaction, perhaps trying to communicate something or fulfill some unfinished task. A few researchers noted the unusual detail that the nurse seemed to become more aggressive or assertive when people attempted to photograph her, as if the act of capturing her image somehow drew her attention and provoked a response. This led to speculation that she was protective of her space, that she did not want to be documented or exposed, and that she would confront anyone who tried. Whatever the truth, the nurse remained a fixture of Corregidor's haunted reputation, and the abandoned hospital continued to draw those brave or foolish enough to explore its ruins. Most visitors reported nothing unusual, seeing only the decay and desolation of a building long abandoned. But a select few, like Michael, encountered something that defied explanation, something that left them shaken and forever changed. And for them, the image of the nurse in white, moving closer with each photograph, her hollow eyes, staring back at them, became a memory that would never fade, a reminder that some places are haunted not just by the past, but by presences that refuse to let go. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories are different. They're quieter but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. They do not rely on sudden scares or dramatic confrontations, but instead weave themselves into your thoughts, making you question what is real and what is not. These are stories that unfold slowly, that build a sense of dread so subtle you do not realize how deeply it has settled into you until it is too late. They come from places where the boundary between the living and the dead is not just thin, but shattered, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary in the most unsettling ways. What follows will challenge your perceptions and leave you with questions that have no easy answers. These are the final two stories, and they are the ones that will linger. The jeepney driver had been working the Cavite route for over 15 years, and he knew every street, every corner, every landmark along the way. His name was Roberto, and he drove the late-night shift, the hours between 11 in the evening and 4 in the morning when most passengers were scarce and the roads were quiet. It was a shift that paid less than the daytime routes, but Roberto preferred it. He liked the solitude, the rhythm of driving through empty streets, with only the occasional passenger to break the silence. But there was one stretch of road that always made him uneasy, a section that ran alongside an old bridge near the outskirts of the city. The bridge had been the site of a serious accident decades ago, a collision involving multiple vehicles that had resulted in several deaths. Since then, the area had gained a reputation among drivers, a place where strange things happened after midnight. Roberto had heard the stories from other drivers, tales of passengers who appeared out of nowhere, who rode in silence and vanished without explanation. He had always dismissed these stories as exaggerations, the product of tired minds and overactive imaginations. But on a cold night in November, Roberto experienced something that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew. It was just past midnight when Roberto approached the bridge. The road was empty, the street lights casting pools of yellow light on the asphalt. As he neared the midpoint of the bridge, he saw a figure standing on the side of the road, one arm raised in the universal gesture for a ride. It was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans. Roberto slowed the jeepney and pulled over, and the young man climbed into the back without a word. Roberto glanced at him in the rearview mirror, expecting some acknowledgement or a destination. But the young man simply sat down and stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. Roberto asked where he was going, but the young man did not respond. Roberto asked again, louder this time, but still there was no reply. The young man's silence was unnerving, but Roberto had encountered quiet passengers before. Some people simply did not like to talk, especially late at night. He put the jeepney in gear and continued driving, deciding he would ask again when they reached the next major intersection. The jeepney moved smoothly through the empty streets, and Roberto kept glancing at the rear view mirror, watching the young man. The passenger remained motionless, his eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead, his hands resting on his knees. There was something about his stillness that made Roberto uncomfortable, a quality that seemed unnatural, as if the young man were not entirely there. After several minutes, Roberto reached a stretch of road that ran parallel to the city's main cemetery. It was a large, sprawling graveyard with high concrete walls and iron gates that were locked at night. Roberto expected the young man to indicate a destination before they passed the cemetery, but instead, the young man suddenly stood up and moved toward the exit at the rear of the jeepney. Roberto called out, asking if this was his stop, but the young man did not respond. He simply stepped down from the jeepney and began walking toward the cemetery gates. Roberto watched in the rearview mirror as the young man crossed the road and approached the cemetery wall. And then, as Roberto sat frozen in disbelief, the young man walked straight through the concrete wall and disappeared. Roberto's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He told himself he had been mistaken, that the lighting had played tricks on his eyes, that the young man must have gone around the wall or through a gap he had not noticed. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. The young man had walked through solid concrete as if it were nothing more than air. Roberto sat there for several long moments, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Then he noticed something else. The jeepney felt different. It felt lighter, as if the weight that had been pressing down on the suspension had suddenly lifted. Roberto got out of the vehicle and walked to the back, examining the seats where the young man had been sitting. The seat was empty as he expected, but there was something strange. The cushion was slightly compressed, as if more than one person had been sitting there. Roberto ran his hand over the fabric and felt a cold dampness, even though the night was dry. He looked up at the cemetery wall, half expecting to see the young man standing there, watching him. But there was nothing. The street was empty, the cemetery silent. Roberto climbed back into the jeepney and drove away, his hands shaking, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Over the following days, Roberto could not stop thinking about the encounter. He asked other drivers if they had experienced anything similar, and to his surprise, several admitted they had. One driver, an older man named Luis, said he had picked up the same young man 3 times over the past year, always near the bridge, always at midnight. Each time, the young man had ridden in silence and exited near the cemetery, and each time, Luis had watched as the young man walked through the cemetery wall and vanished. Luis said he had stopped driving the late-night route because of it, unable to shake the fear that something terrible would happen if he continued. Another driver, a woman named Teresa, shared a similar story, though in her case, the young man had spoken. He had asked her to take him to the cemetery, and when she asked why, he had said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, that he was going home. Teresa had been too frightened to ask what he meant, and when she dropped him off and watched him walk through the wall, she had driven straight to a church and stayed there until sunrise. The stories were remarkably consistent, and the more Roberto heard, the more he became convinced that he had encountered something beyond the realm of the living. He began to research the history of the bridge and the road, looking for any information that might explain the phenomenon. What he found only deepened his unease. The accident that had occurred on the bridge decades ago had involved a passenger bus and several smaller vehicles. The bus had been carrying over 30 passengers when it lost control and crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the shallow river below. The impact had been devastating, and many of the passengers had died instantly. Among the dead was a young man, a college student who had been traveling home to visit his family. His body had been recovered from the wreckage and buried in the cemetery near the road, the same cemetery where Roberto had seen the ghostly figure disappear. The young man's name was listed in the accident report, along with a photograph taken from his identification card. When Roberto saw the photograph, his blood ran cold. It was the same face he had seen in his rearview mirror, the same expressionless stare, the same features. The young man Roberto had picked up was the ghost of the student who had died in the crash, still trying to complete the journey he had started all those years ago. Roberto showed the photograph to Luis and Teresa, and they both confirmed that it was the same person they had encountered. The realization sent a chill through all of them. They had been carrying a ghost, a spirit that was trapped in a loop, endlessly repeating the final moments of its life. Roberto decided he would no longer drive the late-night route past the bridge. He requested a transfer to a different shift, and his supervisor, who had heard similar requests from other drivers over the years, granted it without question. But Roberto's encounter with the ghost jeepney passenger stayed with him, a memory that refused to fade. He found himself thinking about the young man often, wondering what it must be like to be trapped in such a state, unable to move on, unable to find peace. He spoke with a priest about the experience, and the priest suggested that the young man's spirit might be bound to the location of his death, unable to cross over because of the traumatic nature of the accident. The priest offered to conduct a blessing at the bridge in the cemetery, and Roberto agreed to accompany him. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the priest performed the ritual, sprinkling holy water on the road and the cemetery gates, and offering prayers for the souls of those who had died in the accident. Roberto stood by, watching and hoping that the blessing would bring some measure of peace to the young man's spirit. But in the weeks that followed, reports of the ghost passenger continued. Other drivers still encountered the young man near the bridge, still watched as he walked through the cemetery wall, still felt the strange lightness in their vehicles after he departed. It seemed that whatever bound the young man to that place was stronger than prayers and blessings, a tie that could not be easily severed. The story of the ghost jeepney passenger became one of the most enduring legends in Cavite. Drivers would warn newcomers about the stretch of road near the bridge, advising them to avoid picking up passengers there after midnight. Some drivers claimed they had learned to recognize the young man and would simply drive past him, refusing to stop, while others said they felt compelled to pick him up, as if some unseen force was guiding their actions. There were theories about why the young man's spirit remained. Some believed he was waiting for something, perhaps a message to be delivered to his family, or a task to be completed. Others thought he was simply lost, unaware that he had died, and unable to understand why he could not reach his destination. A few suggested that the young man was not alone, that there were other spirits from the accident still lingering near the bridge, and that the sensation of the jeepney becoming lighter was the result of multiple unseen passengers departing at once. This theory was supported by drivers who reported feeling crowded in their vehicles, even when no visible passengers were present, as if the seats were occupied by invisible bodies. The idea that the jeepney was carrying not just one ghost, but several, added a new layer of horror to the legend. It meant that the road near the bridge was not just haunted by a single spirit, but by a collection of souls, all trapped in the same tragic loop. Roberto never forgot the experience, and though he no longer drove the late-night route, he would sometimes pass by the bridge during the day and look toward the cemetery. He wondered if the young man was still there, still waiting by the side of the road for a ride that would never take him home. And on quiet nights, when Roberto lay awake and thought about the encounter, he could still see the young man's face in his mind, expressionless and distant, staring straight ahead as if looking into eternity. It was a face that haunted him, a reminder that the world was filled with mysteries that could not be explained, and that some journeys, once begun, could never truly end. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best. The final story takes us to a place that should be filled with life and laughter, a place where children learn and grow, where the future is shaped one lesson at a time. But in one particular school in Iloilo, there's a room that has become synonymous with fear, a classroom where the past refuses to let go and where the presence of something unseen has turned an ordinary space into a place of dread. This is the story of Room 3B, a haunted classroom where teachers and guards have witnessed phenomena that defy logic, and where students have learned to avoid at all costs, believing that the spirit of a former student still lingers, unwilling or unable to leave. The school was an old public institution, built in the 1960s and serving generations of students from the surrounding neighborhoods. It was a sprawling campus with multiple buildings, each housing classrooms, offices, and facilities that had seen decades of use. Room 3B was located on the third floor of the main academic building, at the end of a long corridor that was dimly lit even during the day. The room was unremarkable in most respects, with rows of wooden desks, a blackboard at the front, and windows that looked out over the school courtyard. But over the years, Room 3B had gained a reputation. It started with small incidents, things that could be easily dismissed as coincidence or the result of an old building settling. Teachers would arrive in the morning to find the chairs rearranged as if someone had been moving them during the night. Desks that had been pushed against the walls would be found in the center of the room, forming strange patterns. At first, the staff blamed students, assuming that some were sneaking into the school after hours to play pranks. But the incidents continued even after security was increased, and it became clear that something else was happening. The school's principal, a practical woman named Mrs. Santos, dismissed the stories as superstition and ordered the maintenance staff to keep the room locked when not in use. But the disturbances did not stop. It was a security guard named Alfredo who first reported hearing the sounds coming from room 3B. He was making his rounds late one night, walking through the third-floor corridor with his flashlight, when he heard the unmistakable sound of chairs scraping against the floor. The sound was coming from room 3B, and Alfredo stopped outside the door, listening. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone were dragging the chairs one by one across the room. Alfredo checked the lock and found it secure, the door firmly closed. He called out, asking if anyone was inside, but there was no response. The scraping stopped for a moment, then resumed, louder this time. Alfredo felt a chill run down his spine. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, shining his flashlight into the room. The classroom was empty. The desks and chairs were in their usual positions, neatly arranged in rows. There was no sign of disturbance, no indication that anything had been moved. But as Alfredo stood in the doorway, he heard the sound again, this time coming from the far corner of the room. It was the sound of a chair scraping, followed by a soft thud, as if someone had sat down. Alfredo aimed his flashlight toward the corner, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on him. Alfredo backed out of the room, locked the door, and returned to his post. He did not mention the incident to anyone at first, afraid that his colleagues would think he was imagining things. But the sounds continued, night after night, and eventually other guards began to report the same phenomenon. The scraping of chairs, the sound of movement, always coming from room 3B, always when the room was locked and empty. The situation escalated when a teacher named Miss Clara had an encounter that left her shaken and unwilling to use the room again. She had stayed late one afternoon to grade papers and had decided to work in room 3B because it was quiet and away from the main offices. As the sun set and the building grew darker, Miss Clara noticed that the air in the room had become unusually cold. She wrapped her sweater tighter around herself and continued working, but the cold persisted, growing more intense with each passing minute. Then she heard a sound, a soft shuffling, like footsteps moving slowly across the floor. Miss Clara looked up from her papers and saw nothing. The room was empty, as it should be, but the sound continued, and it seemed to be coming from behind her. She turned in her chair and saw, standing near the blackboard, the silhouette of a small figure. It was a girl, no older than 10 or 11, dressed in what looked like a school uniform. The girl was facing the wall, her back to Miss Clara, and she stood perfectly still. Miss Clara's breath caught in her throat. She called out, asking who the girl was and what she was doing there, but the girl did not respond. Miss Clara stood up and took a step toward the figure, her heart pounding. As she moved closer, the girl slowly turned her head, just enough that Miss Clara could see her profile. The girl's face was pale, almost gray, and her expression was blank, devoid of emotion. Miss Clara froze, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, in an instant, the girl was gone. She did not walk away or fade out. She simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all. Miss Clara stood alone in the room, her hands trembling, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just seen. She gathered her papers and left the room immediately, locking the door behind her. She went straight to the principal's office and reported the incident, her voice shaking as she described the girl and the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled the room. Mrs. Santos listened, her expression skeptical. but she could see that Miss Clara was genuinely frightened. She assured the teacher that she would look into the matter. Mrs. Santos decided to investigate the room herself, accompanied by Alfredo and another guard. They entered room 3B during the day, when the sunlight filled the space and everything seemed normal. Mrs. Santos examined the room carefully, checking for any signs of tampering or hidden entrances that might explain the disturbances. She found nothing unusual. The room was old and worn, but there was no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. Still, the reports continued. Other teachers began to share their own experiences, admitting that they had felt uncomfortable in room 3B, that they had heard strange sounds or seen shadows moving in their peripheral vision. Students, too, began to avoid the room. Some claimed they had seen the figure of a girl standing in the corner during class, visible only for a moment before disappearing. Others said they felt an oppressive presence in the room, a weight that made it difficult to concentrate or breathe. The fear spread quickly, and soon, room 3B was known throughout the school as the haunted classroom. Parents began to complain, demanding that the room be closed or that their children be moved to different classes. Mrs. Santos, faced with mounting pressure, decided to take action. She contacted a local priest and arranged for a blessing of the room, hoping that a religious ceremony would dispel whatever presence was causing the disturbances. The blessing took place on a Saturday morning, with the priest, Mrs. Santos, several teachers, and a few guards present. The priest performed the ritual, sprinkling holy water throughout the room, reciting prayers, and placing a small crucifix on the teacher's desk. The ceremony lasted about an hour, and when it was finished, the priest assured Mrs. Santos that the room had been cleansed and that the disturbances should cease. For a few weeks, it seemed that the blessing had worked. There were no reports of sounds or sightings, and the teachers who had been assigned to room 3B began to use it again, albeit reluctantly. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, about a month after the blessing, Alfredo was once again making his rounds on the third floor when he heard the familiar sound of chairs scraping in room 3B. He stopped outside the door, his flashlight in hand, and listened. The sound was unmistakable, and it was accompanied by something new, a faint voice, soft and childlike, speaking words he could not understand. Alfredo's heart sank. The blessing had not worked. Whatever was in the room was still there. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there, sitting in one of the chairs near the front of the room, was the figure of a girl. She was facing the wall, her back to the door, and she was sitting perfectly, still. Alfredo called out, his voice shaking, but the girl did not respond. He took a step into the room, and as he did, the girl's chair began to turn, slowly rotating to face him. But the girl herself did not move. Her head remained tilted toward the wall, her body rigid, as if she were a mannequin. The chair continued to turn, creaking softly, until it had completed a full rotation and was facing the wall again. Alfredo backed out of the room, his hands trembling, and slammed the door shut. He did not return to the third floor for the rest of his shift. The incident was reported to Mrs. Santos, and she finally accepted that the situation was beyond her control. She contacted paranormal researchers and local historians, hoping to find an explanation for the haunting. What they uncovered was both tragic and disturbing. According to school records, a student had died in room 3B several decades ago. The girl had been in the 5th grade, and she had suffered a sudden medical emergency during class, collapsing at her desk. Despite efforts to save her, she had died before reaching the hospital. The records indicated that the girl had been sitting near the front of the room, facing the blackboard, when the incident occurred. Her death had been a shock to the school community, and the room had been closed for several weeks out of respect. But eventually, classes had resumed, and the incident had been largely forgotten, at least by those who had not been directly involved. The researchers suggested that the girl's spirit might have remained in the room, perhaps because her death had been so sudden and unexpected, leaving her confused and unable to move on. They noted that the phenomena, the scraping chairs, the figure facing the wall, The sense of cold and dread were consistent with a residual haunting, where traumatic events imprint themselves on a location and replay endlessly. But they also acknowledged that some of the activity, particularly the chair turning and the girl's apparent awareness of observers, suggested an intelligent haunting where the spirit was conscious and possibly trying to communicate. Mrs. Santos decided that the best course of action was to stop using room 3B altogether. The room was locked permanently and classes were reassigned to other locations. A small memorial plaque was placed outside the door, acknowledging the girl who had died and offering prayers for her peace. But even with the room closed, the stories persisted. Students walking past room 3B would hear sounds coming from inside, the scraping of chairs, the soft voice speaking in the darkness. Some claimed they could see movement through the small window in the door, shadows shifting in the dim light. Teachers avoided the third-floor corridor whenever possible, taking longer routes to reach their classrooms. And the guards, including Alfredo, made their rounds quickly and quietly, never lingering near room 3B. The haunted classroom became a permanent part of the school's history, a place where the past and present intersected in ways that no one could fully understand. For those who had witnessed the phenomena firsthand, the memory was indelible. They spoke of the girl in hushed tones, wondering who she had been, what she had experienced in her final moments, and why her spirit had chosen to remain in that room. Some believed she was waiting for someone, perhaps a family member or a friend, to come and help her move on. Others thought she was simply trapped, reliving her death over and over, unable to comprehend what had happened to her. And a few speculated that the girl was not trying to frighten anyone, but was instead seeking comfort, reaching out to the living in the only way she knew how. Whatever the truth, room 3B remained a place of fear and sadness, a reminder that some spirits, for reasons beyond our understanding, cannot or will not leave the places where they died. And so the girl remained, sitting in her chair, facing the wall, her presence a constant and unsettling reminder that the boundary between life and death is thinner than we would like to believe. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best.